Our next speaker is Ashley Williams. Ashley is the William C. and Susan S. Mariner Southern Ceramics Fellow this summer, and she is a PhD candidate in art history and archaeology at Columbia University, where her work primarily focuses on the labor of unfree artisans. This summer, she's taken a close look at a truly iconic piece of art in our collection in her lecture, Leaving the Door Ajar, Earthenware, Andrew Duché, and Archival Absence. Ladies and gentlemen, Ashley Williams.
Hello. So first, I just want to say thank you so much to Daniel, Leah, Melissa, everyone at MESDA, and to William and Susan Mariner for the incredible experience of the Summer Institute. These 4 weeks have been a formative experience that I know are going to stay with me for the rest of my career. And I'm really excited to share my research with you all today. This earthenware jar may be one of the most important American ceramics that remains today. It is currently attributed to Andrew Duché, dated 1736 to 43, and listed as made in Charleston or Savannah. However, as I will argue in this talk, this jar could be from a different time, maker, and place. In addition to reasoning through some of these other possibilities, I will turn to the object itself to think about the social and economic contexts of utilitarian earthenware. What does it mean for this jar to store and contain its own meaning? The story of this jar is one of gaps in the archive and how an object can embody those absences. But first, let's take a look at this object together. It is a lead-glazed earthenware jar with a deep chocolate brown, almost slightly purple color. It is sleek and smooth, like the hard, slightly opaque shell of a beetle. The body is a graceful ovoid shape. The neck is stout with 2 score marks, and the rim ebbs out and back in. On each side, a slightly off-kilter lug handle is formed into an arch and pressed into the body. The thumb marks of a long-ago potter still remain, adding visual detail. There is no capacity mark, but at roughly 13 by 10 inches, the jar is about the size of a large watermelon. The most tantalizing detail for scholars, however, has been the large maker's mark near the rim, which reads AD. After the jar was discovered at a flea market outside Jacksonville, Florida in 1972, it was eventually attributed to Andrew Duché. He was the son of Anthony Duché, a French Huguenot potter who immigrated from England to Philadelphia in 1700 with his family. Duché Sr. was also known to make both English and Westerwald-style stoneware. The few sherds of mugs and chamber pots attributed to Duché Sr. include an AD mark, which is raised and has a cartouche, as you see in the mug on the right. His third son, Andrew, went south as a young man to establish himself, and he was known to be a potter in Charleston and Savannah in the 1730s and 40s. The attribution of MESDA's jar was based on the similarity of the chevron A between the 2 stamps and the assumption that Andrew Duché, who had the same initials, was adapting his father's mark. This, plus Duché's activity in the South and the jar's discovery in Florida, led scholars to conclude that it is an early 18th century Low Country object. This attribution was exciting because Duché remains one of the most important and mysterious potters in 18th century America. In addition to his earthenware production, he was the first settler potter to make stoneware south of Virginia. He moved often and also worked as a trader with the Cherokee Nation. But he is most famous, perhaps, for claiming that he discovered how to reproduce Chinese porcelain in the 1730s. British officials reacted with enthusiasm since in the early 18th century, European empires were in an arms race to reverse engineer the process that Chinese potters guarded with secrecy. Though the trustees of Georgia secured him a 400-pound advance from the crown, Duché never gave proof of his discovery and ended up in such severe debt that he attempted to flee the Georgia colony on a ship to the Bermudas in 1742. At present, it remains unclear whether Duché was a clever entrepreneur or an itinerant con man. His biography is dizzying. This is perhaps why it tends to overshadow the object itself, which is thought to be the only intact signed attributed Duché ceramic today. Duché certainly was an interesting character, but can we be sure that his workshop made this jar? When I examined it, my first thought was that it did not look like a ceramic made in the early 18th century. The bulbous shape of the body, the engaged angled handles, and the rim looked to me more like other jars I had seen, which I will get to shortly. Nevertheless, I set out to find comparable examples from the 18th century in order to confirm the Duché attribution. It did not go well. The only extant 18th century earthenware jars that I have found have drastically different shapes and glazes. They are often smaller, and all of the comparison jars I show are at relative scale to the Mesda jar. So for example, this brown and amber jar from 1700 to 1800, and this rougher early 18th century vessel from Massachusetts. I also looked at Delftware, a fancier form of earthenware, and the shapes were more graduated rather than ovoid and often without handles. All of these ceramics were also smaller and sometimes much smaller than the Mesda jar. It felt like I was grasping at straws because nothing had a similar form or a similar matte chocolate glaze. Given that Duché's father had practiced in England and was also known to make Westerwald-style vessels, I turned to English and German ceramics, wondering if Duché was adapting this form from stoneware into earthenware. But I found no comparable examples. The main problem, and the reason why my attempted comparisons may seem to you so wildly all over the place, is that very little 18th century earthenware survives intact. There are no signed Duché ceramics to compare to. Even when I did find period earthenware, such as at the Charleston Museum, it was in pieces. This is not surprising. Earthenware is fired at a low temperature and is, compared with stoneware and porcelain, quite fragile. Furthermore, utilitarian vessels, such as jars, were inexpensive food storage containers that were made to be used and to eventually break and be discarded. And even the sherds I saw with dark lead glazes tended to be shiny and black, more like jackware, rather than more matte with a brown and purple cast. Next, I turned to more archaeological samples, such as this excavation at Yorktown of ceramics from 1710 to 45. So around the same period as the Duché attribution, though a little further north. But as you can see here, these objects are part of a different stylistic vocabulary. For instance, the stoneware jar from the site tapers more at the bottom and doesn't have handles. I also went looking for other potters with the initials AD. Though there were no conclusive leads, I did find that the A with the chevron crossbar was used by other potters in Europe and the American colonies, something that Bradford Rauschenberg, who's here today, mentions in his excellent biography of Duché. The instances I found range from 17th and 18th century France to 19th century England and Austria. I did find one example from Philadelphia about 100 years after Duché was born there, and other indications that sometimes people just use this A, such as in writing the word April, for fun. So while it is possible that the A stamp links father and son Duché, we also see that this letter was common and it could be someone else's stamp. But of all the perplexing aspects about this object, the handles stand out most to me. I have yet to find similar engaged arch handles on anything before the 1790s. This is something that John Burrison was also puzzled by in his analysis, as he noted that freestanding loops would be more typical of the period. In short, finding 18th century cognates for the jar turned up more questions than answers. Now, when I expanded my search beyond the 18th century, I found some compelling comparisons. For example, this jar from 1800 to 25, which has a similar foot, rim, and body, though it is rounder. And this New England jar from 1780 to 1810, which has an identical ovoid body, though the handles are flat and angled down like little penguin wings. Regarding handles, we get much warmer by comparing to Great Road pottery from Wythe County, Virginia, such as these jars by Christian Buck's workshop from 1795 to 1820. Though the bodies are squatter and more bulbous and the necks are higher, the narrower feet and scoring around the neck is similar. This buck jar comes especially close on the lead glaze color of a more brown and purple hue. It's also roughly the same size. But in all the Great Road examples, the handles are what struck me. They are the same engaged arch handles with the thumbprints of the potter, even if they are slightly more angled out. A final comparison in terms of overall form and proportions is this stoneware jar by Chester Webster's workshop in Randolph County, North Carolina, circa 1850. And so if we look at all these things together, based on what survives, our jar more closely resembles those made in the 19th century and in geographies further north than in Low Country 18th century examples. While it is possible that the forms we see in the 19th century are continuations of beloved earlier forms that just don't survive, at present I have not found comparable objects from the 1730s or 40s. This is not to say that I'm proposing a different attribution. However, I do think that there are some compelling reasons to raise other possibilities, to ask questions, and to build upon the important work of Rauschenberg, Burrison, Howard Smith, and others who have thought about this jar. Could AD be the signature of another workshop in North Carolina or Virginia? Is it from the 19th century? Or has the delicacy and utilitarian nature of earthenware resulted in the loss of similar 18th century Low Country objects? It could be a Duché, and it could be something else. The thing is, most earthenware didn't survive. The vessels were utilitarian and expendable. This jar's survival, despite the great loss in the material archive, is also an important story to tell. And so, building upon the work of Saidia Hartman, Taya Miles, Tiffany Moman, and Torrin Gatson, for the rest of this talk, I will shift gears to embrace the space of not knowing. I'm interested in how the social and economic context of utilitarian ceramics actively constructs uncertainty and archival loss, especially as it relates to slavery, which is essential context for all of this jar's potential geographies and temporalities. To do so, we must think about who is making and who is using utilitarian ceramics, and what the object reveals about its own life. The labor of making pottery was done by a workshop of many hands. Digging and hauling the clay was tough work. It would then be strained, ground, wedged, and weighed. The jar's smooth sides indicate that it was thrown on a wheel where the potter carefully worked the body upwards, pivoting to bring it back in for the rim. With the wheel still spinning, they used a fine tool to score the neck twice. They made two thick handles, worked them into ridges, and attached them each to one side, pressing firmly with a thumb to secure them on. Once the body and handles were successful, they pressed the 80 stamp near the neck. After the vessel dried, it was fully submerged into a vat of lead oxide glaze. This bare spot under the handle was where the potter's fingers held it while dipping. The slightly opaque purple cast, which makes the color of this vessel so unique, may be coming from added manganese. Firing earthenware was dangerous and exhausting work that required enough wood and tending of the kiln to reach a temperature of 800 to 1,000 degrees Celsius. Potters were trained to recognize the temperature by the fire's color. Once the kiln burned long enough to vitrify the jar's glaze, they would begin the days-long process of cooling. Success was never guaranteed. 100 things could go wrong. Vessels can shatter or melt. Glazes can scorch or color unevenly. That this jar emerged beautiful and intact rather than destined for the waster pile is a small miracle. It is also the result of skilled labor and expertise. As in many trades, pottery workshops could include a mix of white, free black, and enslaved black people. If this jar was indeed made in Duché's workshop during his time in Charleston from 1733 to 34, it's certainly possible that enslaved potters were involved. We do know that Duché was an avid proponent of slavery and an enslaver at other points in his life. When he moved to Savannah in 1738, Georgia had recently been founded as a colony for the working poor, and slavery was banned. Duché only moved because the trustees of the colony had promised to lift the ban. When they reneged, Duché formed an anti-government group that agitated for slavery. In the meantime, he took on 2 German indentured potters. In 1743, frustrated by the continued ban on slavery, he left the Georgia colony permanently. Aside from a few years in England, he lived the rest of his life in South Carolina, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, places where he could rely on enslaved labor once more. In 1778, the year of his death in Philadelphia, he is documented as enslaving 2 women. Though the jar may not have been made by Duché in this place or period, his story is useful for illustrating a broader trend, that potters across the colonies and the early United States often relied on unfree labor to expand thin profit margins. Whether made in the 18th or 19th century, it is possible that enslaved people were involved. For enslaved artisans broadly, learning a trade provided better prospects than fieldwork. In some cases, enslaved artisans could hire themselves out to earn money that they could use to purchase their own freedom or that of their family. For example, the potter Peter Oliver, who was enslaved by the Moravians here in Salem, was able to do so in 1800. Just as earthenware's origins could be tied up in systems of hierarchy and power, so too was the way that it was used in the world. Earthenware was so ubiquitous that it was almost disposable, and yet it was an essential household tool for storing and preserving food among rich and poor, free and enslaved. If we stick with a Low-Country lens, mid-18th century probates from Savannah provide insight into the place of ceramics in wealthy households. Patrick Graham was a prosperous planter who served as 3rd president of the Georgia colony. His 1756 probate includes multiple properties, crops, livestock, gilt mirrors, gold buckles, damasks, silver tea accessories, and more. We also see a range of ceramics. So the first one says a parcel of earthen dishes and plates valued at £1, and below that, a parcel of chinaware valued at £2. His most valuable property, however, were 20 enslaved people identified only as men, women, and children. They were appraised at £493. I am interested in this gulf between the appraised value of the enslaved people and the ceramics because it was, at least in these wealthy white households, enslaved people that gave utilitarian ceramics function and value. So when we ask who used this jar, while there are many possibilities over time, we might think of it as a type of object that could exist in these elite households and that was primarily used by enslaved people. It existed in a network of foodways made possible by enslaved people who cared for and harvested plants and animals, who preserved those foods, who cooked them and served them. Jars were food storage vessels that could contain salted pork, lard, vinegar, and the pickled vegetables, relishes, and chutneys that were a crucial condiment for meat dishes. Both earthenware and stoneware were the Tupperware of the pre-modern world. Looking closely, we see traces of this use. The interior shows the most dramatic damage as seen in the glaze that is missing, chipped by a ladle scooping in repeatedly, or perhaps eroded away by acidic contents. Earthenware was also just one type of vessel in a spectrum of ceramics in a wealthy slaveholding household. This spectrum included West African and indigenous-inspired colonaware used by enslaved people for their own food production, earthenware used in food preparation for enslavers, and luxurious porcelain used by enslavers, such as this Chinese import dish from Drayton Hall. These are not hard and fast categories, however. We know that both enslaved and free Black people purchased turned earthenware, creamware, and other high-end ceramics to nourish their own survival and self-determination. Given utilitarian earthenware's fairly low status in this hierarchy, though, it is a marvel that the vessel survives intact today. Still, traces of its journey over the centuries are evident in several hairline fractures, numerous chips on the exterior glaze, and a large repair on the bottom where conservators in the 1980s filled a sizable hole. Looking under UV light, we see traces of this more recent past, repairs, fills, and some kind of residue that fluoresces around the rim and drips down the handles. As I hope I've shown today, compelling questions about this object remain. Was the jar made in Duché's workshop in Charleston or Savannah circa 1736 to 43? Or does its form and glaze point us to a later period, perhaps 1790 to 1850, in Virginia or North Carolina? Possible next steps for solving this mystery might include scientific analysis of the glaze and clay body to determine geographic origins, more extensive comparative analysis with archaeology collections, broader iconographic study of ceramic makers' marks, and most exciting and interesting, Archaeological excavations of Duché's kiln sites that could provide access to waster piles with sherds that might confirm similar forms, glazes, or stamps. For now, the void inside the jar is also the absence in the archive, though there are clues that gesture to a wider world that it was born from. This is a story about objects, food, and most importantly, people in motion. It is also a story about luck and survival. By looking closely at this jar in Mesda's collection, we can begin to interpret the information it contains and the secrets it still holds. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. We'll now take a brief break and we will reconvene at 11:20.